We've got an interesting session this afternoon, community and culture, but we'd also like to sort of talk about some of the language aspects as well. Some of the ACRs really want to emphasise the importance of language and what they do. The speakers, we've got 6 speakers, 4 key topics, 6 speakers. Tim Acker, Tim is from Curtin University and he'll be the first up, followed by Damien Jacobson. Damien's from Southern Cross University. Tammy Abbott, Senior Research Officer based out of Alice Springs, and Aboriginal community researchers Lorraine King and Mark Inkamala, and finally Mike Dockery, also from Curtin University based out of Perth. First presentation is Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Art Economies Project. The research leader is Tim Acker, and as I said, Tim comes from Curtin University.
Good afternoon and welcome. I'd like to welcome you to the Art Economies Project with an acknowledgement of the Ngunnawal country that we are meeting on this afternoon. You've heard a lot of stories during the day about what an extraordinary place remote Australia is and the incredible range and diversity of things it contains, and the Art Project is another facet of that extraordinary variety that exists in remote Australia. And that variety is cultural diversity. There is creative energy that exists in remote Australia that if you looked at a map only, a conventional map, you wouldn't perhaps recognise that, but there really is a richness and a variety that exists in remote Australia that has been behind the extraordinary success of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander art for over 40 years. And I guess the thing that even after quite a few years of working in this industry that still astonishes me is how the breadth of that cultural range that exists out there, from the outer reaches of the Torres Strait, Darnley Island, down to sort of Noongar country, Wadjuk country, south of Perth, through from Culumbaroo to outback New South Wales. The extraordinary range and content that exists amongst the Aboriginal people, Torres Strait Islander people in all those zones is something that I think is expressed at its best in many ways through the art that you see on gallery walls and in many places around whenever we're talking about Australia or Australian identity, it often appears. And that the reason I think that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander art has been so successful for 40 years now, it's been one of the very rare and very long-term, very sustained success for remote people, is that it allows an exchange and a reciprocity with mainstream Australia. That really Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander worldviews are a long way from the worldviews of mainstream Australia, and art allows an exchange and a point of intersection that is equal, that is respectful, and that works despite perhaps some of the obvious barriers that has worked for a long time. And it's that point of exchange that the Art Economies Project is looking at over the next few years. And again, one of the things that I keep coming back to in this project and moving through the industry and the sector more widely is the art that's produced is very local. It's a reflection of the circumstances and the conditions and the qualities of each of the communities it's created in. So again, using that example of Darnley Island in Torres Strait, or Balgo in the Kimberley, or Warrakurna, or Galawinku, whichever point on the map, whichever community you look at, there is a unique set of drivers, unique set of circumstances that exist in that community that make that art distinctive and extraordinary in its own right. It doesn't take very long in this sector to look through a book or visit a gallery and be able to identify individual communities from amongst a wall of paintings. And that variety also adds complexity to it. And when we come to doing things like research and sort of unpacking the issues and often bringing that sort of rigorous or reductionist mindset that researchers do, it becomes a very tangled up, very complicated space, but often also in good ways. And I guess in perhaps one of the ways, or give you a little tour through the way in designing this project that we have sort of understood that complexity and tried to reflect the range and variety of experience and creativity that exists out there. The way we've tried to build that into the research, the 6 research areas that we have. This is a map that's a couple of years old, but it's still reasonably accurate in terms of the spread and number and variety of art enterprises that exist in remote Australia. If you overlay that with the remoteness map, and also the maps are complex and contested things when it comes to cross-cultural issues, and you've seen a range of maps today, and this is yet another take on, from the art perspective, of looking at what happens within regions. That Aboriginal art, like I said, exists in as many forms as there are artists and art centres and art communities, but there are also some strong similarities and groupings within those, and we have divided Australia up into 12 remote art regions, and our data analysis and so on, which I'll talk about shortly, works within those regions to understand local conditions and similarities, but also comparisons. For us also, knowing the kind of geography, there's also zones in which the arts sector works. Clearly, artists as the creators and generators of all the cultural and creative products you see. For 40 years or so, they've been producing works that have travelled around the world. That itself is based on thousands and tens of thousands of years of cultural practices, so there's a direct continuity there. Agents take many forms. They're the links between artists and the audiences, consumers around the world, and audiences themselves. They're exhibitors, they're writers, they're buyers, and so on. So those 3 zones link in, back and forth. It's not a one-way relationship by any means. And again, each of those zones has their own circumstances, the things that makes them unique or makes them complicated or just adds to the qualities of each of those. And of course, between each of those groups or each of those factors is a series of relationships, again working in both ways. And this is still an oversimplification of things, but this spaghetti map, as we call it, has allowed us to think through and design the research that acknowledges, honours and builds on the sort of circumstances that exist. So for us, stripping it back down to the 3 basic zones in which the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander art sector works, we've overlaid that with 6 research projects, and I'll talk about each of these in more detail shortly. But we have a scope and scale project, a micro-enterprise project, a consumer-based project looking at buyers, a human resources project, and a freelance artist one, which is a tricky one, and e-commerce, e-business one project. Just before I get on to talking about those projects in a little more detail, just to give update or bring some of the industry circumstances back to the sort of conditions of the last few years. There's been, as I said, there's enormous change and complexity in the industry, but the last few years in particular have seen extra levels of churn. And all those things interplayed have resulted in a fair amount of instability and disconnection within the sector. And out of those challenges have also come opportunities and adaptation. So there's a lot of pressure for art businesses, artists themselves, to adapt, to throw out old assumptions, to look for new ways of doing business, as some of the basic conditions that have and assumptions that have guided the sector for many of its first few decades have perhaps not disappeared, but have certainly changed shape and shrunk and presented some pretty major obstacles. I won't talk about these in detail, but like I said, hopefully that gives you some sense of the sort of external and internal drivers that have really made it a challenging time in the last 4 or 5 years in particular. One of the CRC itself has really invested in and designed this project in response to some of the things I was talking about earlier, that there is an extraordinary success encapsulated by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander art and art enterprise. And it remains, despite the change, despite the churn, despite the challenges and the need for adaptation, that remains a very potent means of creating a local livelihood, and that local success, the ability for people on country in small communities, regardless of isolation and so on, to create that livelihood that makes sense, is culturally relevant and makes sense in a local setting. That remains at its core, and in some ways cuts across these things, but it does make it a more difficult business to be in. I just wanted to give a bit more of a detail of our 6 research areas, the 6 projects we have. The Scope and Scale project is in some ways our headline project. It grew out of some recommendations of the 2007 Senate inquiry, looking at trying to answer some of the basic questions of how many, how much, and we're taking that as a starting point, but hopefully we're working our way towards far more refined details and information, which I'll show you some early findings on shortly. But it's a bit of a linking project because it deals with external issues such as funding levels, it deals with market forces, it deals with production and sales and so on within the communities, and analyses those individually, but also finds the linkages between them. The Remote Area Microenterprise project is a large one for us. Again, I'll talk more about that, but it's understanding success and failure factors in 4 different zones out bush. The consumer dynamics is what are people buying and why are they buying it? What are the triggers? What are the motivations? The way, the type of, not so much the type of people, but the way an audience approaches an art fair or a sale in a gallery and so on. There's a complicated and changing profile of people buying Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander art. Human resources is another key one. It's one of the projects I'm hoping we can grow a little bit, because it's one that cuts across so much of remote community life, is the ability to attract and retain staff that give a small non-profit challenged organisation its best chance, and you can often plot the success and failure of an art centre or a community organisation by the quality and continuity of people. So understanding the push and pull factors of people working in remote Australia is crucial for the arts, but it's probably one of our projects that touches on a lot of the CRC's work. The e-business project is another one that I'm a real fan of. I think it's something that can have some very immediate impacts. E-business promises a lot, but it's only delivered for a very small number of art centres and arts enterprises to date. That's a generalisation. There's a lot of subtlety in that, but it's something we'd like to understand more of. And the Art Outside Art Centres is a project that is looking at some of the issues in probably the most complicated zone within the wider industry, which is freelance artists operating in particularly towns like Alice Springs and Katherine, who work outside of, I call the freelance market, who work outside of art centres, and it's the zone in which you get the greatest sort of level of conflict and contestation and media and so on. And it's again, we've got some early findings I'd like to talk you through. This is, of course, an extraordinary team we have. I'm a part-time research leader that has 6 people on the team. Alice Woodhead is she's our sort of number and systems boss. She's based at Southern Cross Uni and comes from a sort of a big industry, or a long work experience in a variety of industries, and like I said, she's really driving our the analysis and the ways that the findings of the Scope and Scale project in particular can link across to other areas, because there are, like I said, that's what sort of the Scope and Scale project is essentially the spine of the wider art project, and most of the researchers will be able to draw on that, and Alice is sort of is the architect of that. Susan Congreve, she's one of our PhD candidates at Curtin University, but based in Darwin. She's taking on one of the micro-enterprise projects and looking at the external factors, the enabling environment for art centres, in particular, looking at the Central Northern Territory and the Torres Strait. And Kim and Susan have complementary projects. Kim is, again, looking at the success and failure factors, but the other end of the looking glass, she's looking at the community issues, the governance, the politics, isolation, the kind of mechanics of what makes an art centre succeed or fail at that very community level. And like I said, Susan's looking in from outside of the intersection between art enterprise and those enabling factors of government policy or wider changes in industry. Jessica Booth is our master's student based in Melbourne through UniSA, and she has the Consumer Dynamics project looking at what people are buying and why they're buying it. Michelle Whittle is based at Flinders University in Adelaide and is an honours student looking at the Human Resources project, which involves interviews with about 25 or 30 past and present managers and really unpacking the push and pull factors, why people take up a job, what they find when they're there, and the triggers as they leave or what makes them leave. And last but by no means least is Iris, who's based at, she's through Southern Cross Uni but based in Alice Springs. She's a part-time honours student but works full-time at one of the art centres in Alice Springs, Nurajuta, and she's looking at the e-commerce project. She comes from a marketing background, and with the art centre working life to frame her work, it should be an interesting project. And that's one thing that I think why I really enjoy working with this team is that the majority of them have direct and extensive community experience, whether it's in the arts or whether it's remote, having worked with remote communities for many years, the ability to work directly with, sit down with, understand, decode all the sorts of issues around this has meant that all of them have been able to move very quickly in their project and get a lot of traction and the work through the networks that's necessary to make a project like this work. Okay, quick tour through some early results. This is the scope and scale project that Alice is driving. Like I said, the scope and scale project has 3 buckets of data. We've got about 70 odd of 80 art centres have contributed pretty extensive financial records. That's being processed at the moment. We have about 10 years worth of government funding records from state and Commonwealth that's being processed, and we also have this survey of about 200 art businesses. So Alice is up to her eyeballs in several 100,000 lines of Excel data. But just for today's purposes, to give you a quick snapshot of some of the early findings have been out of the industry survey. So we could identify around about 200 private and about 80 public art businesses. We put together a pretty extensive survey and got about a 50% response rate. And you'll see a few figures up there about the kind of a quick demographic snapshot, I guess, of the number of Aboriginal people owning those businesses, the location and the sort of gender split between the business owners. One of the surprise was that how long people had been in business, that the majority of people weren't fly-by-nighters or sort of quick backyard operators, that there had been a continuity and a commitment from many art businesses. A very surprising finding was that nearly over a third of the works sold and bought by these galleries and dealers were purchased directly from artists. I think that's probably a big growth on what it was 5 and certainly 10 years ago, and less than half directly from art centres. Sales were down, which is no surprise, post-GFC, post some of those other conditions that I talked about early, but there was optimism out there that people actually expected growth over the next 5 years. I love a good pie chart. It's made me very happy in the last few months as various researchers have sent in a little trial pie chart, and I never thought I would be so happy to see a little colourful chart on my email. But again, just 2 quick ones from this survey. Where buyers are located, so this is asking galleries and dealers where their customers are located. Majority in New South Wales, but a few other surprises in there, what a large proportion the Northern Territory is. And also asking a different end of the survey asked about where people expected growth and contraction in the market. So some different market sectors from private buyers, international buyers and so on, where they expected growth to come. No surprise that the superannuation end, for example, is where they're expecting lots of contraction still following some regulatory changes. This is the survey of artists who worked outside art centres, and we did about 65 artists interviews, or say we, the business development unit of the community researchers of Ninti One did those surveys in Alice Springs and Katherine and a couple out bush. And again, still being processed. It's a fairly extensive survey and it needs a lot of interpretation, and it also needs to link across to about 20 surveys and interviews we did with dealers and private agents in Alice Springs. So there's some real crossover things that need to be teased out. And again, a quick snapshot. We asked a question about how people adapted their own artistic practice depending on who they were selling the painting to, and nearly 2/3 of artists said that they painted or produced different work for different, according to the customer or the gallery they were selling to. And a couple of these, some of the findings, there were sort of two threads for me as I glanced through them, was that some things kind of debunked assumptions that work in this sector. And as I said earlier, this is a sector that has lots of controversy, and there's accusations about unethical conduct and unconscionable dealings and so on. And the truth of those is fuzzy at best, but there are often a lot of assumptions that are tossed around. And these are two, for example, that I think start debunking some of those assumptions. So, for example, the second one, that 4/5 of people don't get book up, and by that there's often an assumption in this sector that people are indebted constantly to their dealer, that they only paint in response to, or forced to paint in response to having some indeterminate amount of book up. But 4/5 of people said they don't have a book up relationship with their dealers. On the other side of the coin, though, there was also some affirmations of the lack of the sort of deficits in the freelance artist market. So 3/4 of people had never heard of or weren't sure about copyright. And as you can see, a large percentage of people, 4/5 of people had no idea where to go if they felt taken advantage of, or if there was an issue that they wanted to be resolved. So some enormous deficits, and we're thinking through now about what we can do with these sort of immediate findings, and there are some obvious sort of partners we might work with to sort of package up some of these things and provide some professional support and advice for artists. And anecdotally, at least, I think this is one sector that will continue to grow. More artists, as younger artists, people more town-based come into being artists on a part-time or full-time basis. I think freelance art market will continue to grow. And a quick tour through some of the findings that Jessa did through the audience surveys. So she did about 1,000 surveys at 3 art fairs, and she's now doing a complementary, much smaller set of surveys through dealers and by sort of collectors and connoisseurs and so on, to see how those things correlate. Again, a quick snapshot of the art fair goers. Certainly a dominated, majority, 3/4 of people attending art fairs are female. Nearly half of people bought an acrylic painting, so paintings is by far and away the sort of number one medium. But also price sensitivity, that great majority of people were unwilling to spend more than a few $100s. And given the amount of difficulty and the sort of profile and arguments around some of the regulatory changes, it was surprising to hear how few people had awareness of things like industry code of conduct and so on. There was the correlation was that people were interested in learning more. So that people wanted to be informed but felt there was a lack of information out there. And just getting close to the end, this is, I guess, a broader sort of take on where we're expecting our outcomes to be. And some of these, as I said, some of these outcomes we're expecting to be very direct, explicit, practical things, like from the HR project or from the e-commerce project. We can take a package of things out to an art centre or a community or an artist or a peak body or something and say, look, here are some findings, here are some ways to fairly easily, fairly quickly reshape what you do, improve your recruitment practice, improve, spend your marketing money in a different way on websites, for example. So we're looking at some, like I said, some very explicit sort of take-home, not easy perhaps, but some very discrete sort of findings that people can apply. Also acknowledging that there will be a range of longer-term and broader outcomes that will take a while to filter through the system, whether that's through policy changes, whether that's through advocacy, whether that's this adaptation process that a lot of art businesses are going through will take a while to perhaps include this information in what they do. But really for us the principle is that we're providing information to people who are undergoing, or organisations that are undergoing, that need information in the face of adaptation. There's undoubtedly a lot of change that will be occurring in the next few years, and we're very strong on making sure that what we're providing is information to assist people in that process. Okay, that's me if anyone wants to chat, but I guess just to conclude, it's really, in remote settings, art business, art centres and so on is often a code for other things like there's livelihoods, training, cultural maintenance, the cultural life of the community and so on. So, and art centres are often, people who know them recognise it, but that it's often under-acknowledged more widely that the role of art in a community is only partly about selling goods and products into the marketplace. It's the richer, the wider contribution that makes to people's livelihoods out bush. And undoubtedly there's an enormous number of challenges for artists as individuals, for their communities in coming years, and we are working hard to make sure that our research is a direct contribution to some of those challenges and solving some of those issues. But for us the basic principle is that art and art business remains highly visible, as strong as it can be, and very vibrant part of remote Australia. So thank you for listening, and if anyone wants to chat later, we'd love to talk further. Thank you.
The next presentation in the Community and Culture session is Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Tourism Project. The research leader is Damien Jacobson. Damien's from Southern Cross University. And Damien, you've got 15 minutes.
First of all, this is Ngunnawal country. I'm not from this area. I'm descended from the Bulkanwara, which is Western Nalangye people in far north Queensland. Thank you all for being here today. Also, I'd like to acknowledge all the Aboriginal people who've sort of travelled from all over parts of Australia to be here for Ninti One's celebrations. Look, I'm going to kick off this little talk about tourism by posing a bit of a question on you all. I want you to bring to mind what you think about Aboriginal people and tourism, as in what comes to mind when you think about that. Now, I want you to hold on to that thought, as I'm talking through these bits and pieces, and we'll try and engage with that as we're going along. Look, I'm going to start off with a few little facts and figures about the sector overall, and specifically I'm going to show you a few things about the remote tourism sector. Now look, I don't expect you to be able to read all the finer details on this particular thing here. In this graph, we're looking at the 13 main remote tourism regions in the country. If anybody's concerned, that's not really how Australia is at the moment. We just sort of put it that way for a bit of a representation. But look, the thing I want to draw your attention to on the chart is the clusterings there in the bottom. Now, we've got each of the 13 main regions, and we've looked at the domestic overnight and also international visitor numbers for these regions over the annual periods for that 4-year period. Domestic day visitors aren't included in these figures because some of the data available was not suitable to be used in this sort of chart. So we've just got the domestic overnight and the international. International figures are coloured in the bars and leaving the domestic overnight figures uncoloured in the thing. And you won't be able to notice it, but I can tell you there's only one of these regions out of all 13 where the international visitors are actually where the domestic visitors are outnumbered by the international visitors. And that's Lassiter, which is third from the right for you guys. and those who know, it's home to Uluru, it's home to the Olgas and those sort of places. Next one is another chart with a few nice bars and things. Again, I won't expect you to be able to read it from where you're seated there. Here we're looking at Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander participation in tourism, and what we've got for each of the bars on the thing there is the specific sector areas that each of the enterprises are involved in. We've got a whole range of different things there. We've got fishing charters, retail, even the ITOs there. What else have we got? I can't even read it from here. National parks and things like that. But look, over on your right-hand side is the two biggest columns. The largest one is cultural tours, and the one alongside it I've grouped together to call tourism tour inclusive. Those include tours, but as part of packages, so there's often a bit of accommodation sort of thrown in then as well. So what you can see, like, we do have a diverse range of participation by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in tourism overall, but by and large there's a very, very strong presence of the cultural side, which I term as Aboriginal tourism. With these factors in mind, we decided to approach the remote tourism project from using a particular collection of perspectives. And the first one on the top there is that we have an overall objective to decolonise discourse about Aboriginal tourism. Now look, what that refers to is our project group and the way we're going about it. We have, well, I'm calling that we have 4 people in the project. We only have 3 at the moment. We've already finished one of our honours students, but we have, in addition to her, there's been two PhD students and myself. 2 of those people are Aboriginal. So what this introduces is there's no such thing as the Aboriginal perspective in anything, but we are including some Aboriginal perspectives in the conduct of this research into Aboriginal tourism. Now, I'm based at Southern Cross Uni, as Steve said. Our students are based at, there's one at Uni SA, and there's also another one at Flinders University. One of the other ways we're approaching this work is to ask questions in a different kind of way. So, by innovative, we mean looking at tourism issues for Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people in a particular kind of way. So I've asked you to reflect on what tourism and Aboriginal people mean in your mind, and I'm going to take a stab and suggest that a lot of you would have came up with culture. Tourism would involve culture, and coupled with that, it would also involve a lot of international visitors as well. By and large, that's the common perception of what tourism is for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. The view that we're taking in this project is slightly different. We're taking the view of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander involvement in tourism. That does include Aboriginal tourism, but then in the remote tourism in the remote context, we also include something called remote tourism as well, which introduces a much more diverse perspective and a lot more different kind of development and enterprise sort of opportunities. So the way we're approaching this work is to view tourism as a system, Remote tourism itself is part of much broader tourism systems, and on its own, it constitutes its own system as well. But look, we've had to recognise, like we did lit reviews and background studies and all of this sort of thing, and looked at what other agencies and things like that have been doing, and recognised that there's a lot of useful stuff available and out there for Aboriginal people already, so we don't need to reinvent the wheel on certain kinds of things. So we've decided to go about this project looking at various components of the system. So, example, entrepreneurship. Now, yes, there's been a fair bit done on that, but we're specifically looking in the remote context, particularly tourism on country. We're looking at issues like diversification, regional development, marketing. Now, we've got two sides of the coin there, and one is looking at international visitors, undertaken by one of our PhD students, a lady at Flinders University, and the other side of the coin is, of course, the domestic visitors, which has been carried out at UniSA by our other PhD student. What other things have we got? Oh yes, of course, the one that I'm primarily interested in, reconciliation through tourism. So we've got a whole range of different things on our agenda. I'm not going to cover all of them today. I don't really have the time. I'll just focus on one of the projects that's already been completed, just to give you a little bit of a taste of the kind of things that are emerging from this work. Look, I've put the words long-term there as part of our approach to help describe the way we're going about the question of knowledge that we want to come out of this research. This focus is long term in as such because we're mainly looking at knowledge for strategy, for planning, so that people can go about their tourism development and enterprise and initiatives in ways that use based on knowledge that's appropriate to their context and their particular needs. So it's not suggesting that there's a one-size-fits-all in remote tourism. That's not the case. There's localised issues, in all areas. It's pretty well across the board. But the question of remote tourism has a set of challenges and issues attached to it. So we want to work towards developing a whole suite of knowledge that develops strategy and planning that can engage with that. And finally, the last one, collaborative. We're going about this work through consultation with small to medium remote Aboriginal tourism enterprise. And also, we're also linking in with other Ninti One projects as well. So I have a few discussions with Tim, who you just heard from, some of the other speakers that we also heard from this morning as well. Because the question of tourism, it crosses over all different areas of interest. So we've had to have various discussions with people about that sort of thing. Look, in regards to the output and impact for the project, like these are the kind of issues that we have to weigh up. I mean, obviously, small to medium Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander enterprises at the top of the list. They're our number one priority as we're putting together the projects. But in doing that, like I've already sort of hinted to before, is we're keeping present to the mind the issue of remote context and how we go about investigating these issues by keeping the challenges and issues, a key part in how we go about all of the work. Another one, of course, is the relevance to the sector. Look, overall, the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander sector is relatively mature. However, based on our reviews on things like that, it is in a sort of a transition sort of phase. There's a few shifts in the way the whole question of tourism is being approached in a broader sense, but then also at the grassroots level as well. So we've been mindful of that and keep that in mind when we're putting together the projects. And also, of course, the broad stakeholder interest groups, those directly involved with Ninti One, but of course those also with sort of broader linkage with the tourism sector. And of course, relevance to theory. That's a bit of an interesting one, because when I talked about the, having that shift to not just looking at Aboriginal tourism, but also coupling that with remote tourism, opportunities for Aboriginal people. What that does is it opens the door for different kinds of theory to sort of be brought into the debate about tourism for blackfellas. So in a sense, there's a bit of a shift in mindset going on as well in the academy, but then also sort of on the ground and how we go about in developing the sector. Okay, so the work that our student did was with small remote entrepreneur. Undertook that project collaboratively, as I've already indicated. So we went through steps of her being invited on country, that the participants were key drivers in carrying out that project. Even so much as down as them determining, how much was enough research engagement, which we were way out. They actually wanted more than what we thought was initially would be sufficient. So that involved being prepared to go back for an extra trip. It was on their terms, and that's the way we went about it. Being in a remote context, the issue of seasonality played a big role in how they went about sort of their overall initiative, because I won't specifically call it an enterprise. It was more better described as initiative, and the reason I can say that is this thing called diversification. So their involvement in tourism was not just one thing. It was a range of different things, and while we could sort of relate that to responding to a few different issues and conditions and things like that, the question of seasonality did figure pretty large in that. Basically, what seasonality means in tourism speak, I suppose, is that tourism season starts and then it ends, and there could be like 3-4 month gap where they're not going to get any visitors at all. So if these fellows want to stay on country, which is what they really want to do, the tourism initiative is a really big driving factor of remaining on their country, connected and all that sort of thing. Carrying out the obligations for the elders, which we've sort of noted there, and balanced obligation, all that sort of thing. Having a diversified approach to tourism seemed to be a very, very big part of ensuring that they can carry that out. Of course, I've sort of noted tourism on country and also the balanced obligation. I sort of hinted to that as well. Look, another important thing that came out of it was the importance of networking. And look, as a remote operator, there might be one enterprise there, another one over there, and that other mob are sort of over there type of thing. So these guys really valued a sense of interconnected with all the local enterprises. But they also placed a lot of emphasis on interconnectedness at a broader regional level, also at a broader state level, and then national level, and even an international level as well. Engaging with Indigenous brothers and sisters from countries overseas like Canada and all of those sort of places. And look, the last thing I'll quickly mention is this issue of growth capacity. Now look, in the deficit model, in the deficit way of thinking about issues for Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people, you might view growth capacity as something, issues from within, as in skills and all of those different sorts of things. Growth capacity for these guys was stifled more often than not by external sources. But before I wrap up, I was just going to bring us back to a few of the broader issues in relation to Aboriginal tourism and remote tourism overall. First of these is a few facts and figures about Aboriginal tourism itself. So I mentioned sort of domestic tourists and international tourists. So 2009 figures is all of this stuff here. 2009, 71% of all Aboriginal tourism visitors were domestic, but that constituted less than 3% of overall domestic visitor activity. Look at international tourists there, the percentage of which Aboriginal tourists, about 29%. Annual trend for each one, domestics decline about average 19% decline per year. Annual trend for international visitors about a 4.95% decline per year. Getting onto the remote visitor stats as well. Look, I'm just going to sort of gloss through these really quick. Here we have a slight increase of domestic visitors. Look at that, about sort of 1.7% increase per year. Not bad. But then when we go to the international visitors, there's about a 5% decrease per year. Look, overall the figures for remote tourism aren't too glossy, really. So it raises the question of how relevant issues of strategic knowledge, planning knowledge, building local capacity, and engaging with overcoming the challenging context of remote tourism are for Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people. And I'm out of time. I am. Thank you very much.
The next presentation will be a team effort led by Tammy Abbott, Senior Researcher with Aboriginal Community Researchers. Tammy's based at Alice Spring, and joining her on the stage will be Lorraine King and Mark Inkamala. Come on up, folks.
What a in Pijandar Engine, regular let's bring a door of Pijan. And young Jim Evan, Mary Godinan Mabak, then Maryland Mabak Elegant, in the Wire Pijan, and one Tangilik Ninti One 10 years no matter. And
Hello everyone, I'm translating Cream. I've travelled from Amherstburg and a long way to be here and do our presentation, and also I like to acknowledge the traditional owners, the past, the future and the present. Oh well, anyway. Forgot, I'm nervous. Yeah.
Hello everybody, my name is Tammy Abbott, and as Steve's already introduced me, I work from the main office in Alice Springs. We're going to talk to you today about the Aboriginal researchers and the work they do for Ninti. Space bar. So a large part of Ninti One's research employs local community members. The reason is simply the results of the research are better because local people are more informed and have an in-depth understanding of history, community, language and culture. Trained Aboriginal community researchers make an essential contribution to research in several ways. They use a range of skills, Aboriginal language and literacies, and contribute to all phases of the research, including design and fieldwork in their communities.
Awal, kikinan nuna nang likod ko na kikinan. Kasi iwan nan mapa nuna ngorka penyuap community project. Nang kikinan ko na kikinan Spain man kikinan. Wala ka nang kikinan. It's up iwan. Awal.
Sorry, I've got to translate here. It is really important for us to do research and train community researchers in our own language and try and get the information in our own language as well, and engage the rest of the community and create some more jobs for the community locals as well.
They are skilled in undertaking all aspects of high quality research, including face-to-face surveys, focus groups, data collection, cultural analysis and reporting.
Hello everyone. I got to introduce myself actually. My name's Lorraine and I come from Papunya. I was born and raised there and I currently live and work in Umwa. I actually work for the Housing SA as a full-time, but I do have a casual job with Ninti One and I've actually been doing it for 3 years and it's been great and given me a lot of opportunities to branch out and, you know, sort other work as well too and try and encourage Indigenous people from remote communities how important research is and working from inside to outside as well. And Ninti One also provides us with opportunities like for locals to get jobs in their own communities and be proud of what they're researching about because it's about their community at the end of the day.
They provide unique insights and understandings into local communities in remote Australia.
We community researchers have the knowledge to be able to do it in our own way, especially in our own language and talking to other Indigenous people as well and doing it ethically and trying to get the information that meets our own ethical standards.
Cultural ethical standards, I think she's talking about, yeah.
Yes, sorry, cultural. Missed that one out.
They are proud to be undertaking research which will benefit people living and working in remote Australia.
Urka penjal ka nang iwan nang marang urka penjal and belar pun upload nang ay nang koi nang urka penjal iwan nang kari ka nang better man ka.
We get employment opportunities and the chance to work with our own communities and to engage community members as well.
These processes are important, but the results are what we value the most. Examples include recommendations on practical ways to improve services in education, vehicle safety, aged care, employment and other services, knowledge to support tobacco use reduction, advice on improving governance and communication. Aboriginal community researchers also play a key role in many of the CRC REP research projects. Thank you. That's remote education systems and mobility, just to name a couple.
Okay, thank you team, that was great. The Aboriginal Community Researcher Network is very much there to also get the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander viewpoints into questionnaires and survey design. It's all about based on valuing and respecting Aboriginal and Torres Strait culture. The importance of language is coming through from that presentation, and as I've been explained to me, it's about working inwards and outwards. It's the genuine understanding and engagement about what the project is supposed to be doing from an Aboriginal community perspective. We get employed to do work and can explain to the community what it's all about. So very, very powerful and important. In fact, one of the projects that is extensively using the Aboriginal Community Researcher Network is a CRC project on Aboriginal mobility. And that project is led by Mike Dockery. Mike's from Curtin University, and he's the project leader on the Aboriginal Mobility Project, but his talk's going to be on reconceptualising Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander mobility, again, part of challenging some of these assumptions. Mike, over to you.
Great, thanks, Steve. I know it's been a very long day, and I can rest assured that the people that are still here are at least very interested in the research, or else we'll do almost anything for a free drink. But I'm not sure which, but I'm going to do something a bit different. I'm lost some slides already. All right, I'm not really going to talk much about my project. What we know is that Aboriginal people in Central Australia are highly mobile, and this creates lots of problems for delivering services, for education, for employment. And what I want to do is unpack this prism through which we see Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander mobility as being problematic, and ask, well, is there a better way to think about mobility? A way that's better for policy and for delivering services. So it's a little bit of a thought journey, if you'll bear with me. Just got 10 more minutes or so to go. Hopefully it'll all come together at the end. So well, I'll start by looking at some of the ways other people and other disciplines have thought about mobility. Okay, in economics, we've got the Harris-Tadaro model, and this is very much about economists think that people move to maximise our utility. To economists, that means maximise our income. So when we look at where people move, and particularly in the early days of industrialisation, there was this mystery as to why you got such big pools of unemployment in the city. Why do people keep coming to the city when there's so much unemployment? The answer is because the wages are much higher. And it's not actual incomes that you maximise, it's your expected income. So even if there's high unemployment in the urban areas, people still move there if there's a chance of getting a high-paying job. Okay, so it's not actual incomes or unemployment that should equalise, it's expected income across regions. So these were very powerful in explaining rural to urban migration during stages of industrialisation. Gravity models, basically you think about locations or places as planets out in space, where the bigger they are, the stronger the attraction, and the closer they are, the stronger the attraction. This is the idea of gravity models, except you don't have to think about the distance in terms of kilometres or space. It can be a distance in terms of cultural differences or language differences. So these models, for example, are used in explaining trade flows. We find that international trade, much more trade if the countries are big, the economies are big, if they're close together, if they have common languages, similar per capita incomes. Okay? And finally, something that came out of the previous Desert Knowledge CRC work, and specifically a model for arid Australia or remote Australia, McAllister looked at this model, basically what flora and fauna, it looks at the amazing different ways flora and fauna try to access resources when resources are scarce and variable. So these amazing strategies that, aquatic animals that can lie dormant for 10 years until, it rains again, there's a good rain again, plants and things like that. And one of the ones they point out is nomadism, which is people moving into areas where there's plentiful resources and back out again when this changes. So that's some of the previous sort of models of mobility, way people think about mobility. What do we know about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander mobility? Well, one thing we know is that from the very first engagement with white settlers, it was seen as problematic, this sort of random, unproductive, going walkabout thing. And in actual fact, many of the policies that followed had the specific aim to try and stamp this out, to sedentarise the population. We had permit systems, we had forced removal from land, resettlements, missionaries and so on, specifically to stop people moving around, Aboriginal people. And even to this day, we still see, you still commonly hear how mobility is this sort of, problem as far as, the closing the gap agenda and the delivery of services and so on. And because of that, we really have to understand existing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander mobility in that context, that a lot of the mobility that now happens is actually a legacy of past problems. Because of the displacement from kin, from land, a lot of the movement that now happens is people coming back to re-engage or reconnect with where they've been moved or displaced. So you've got to understand current contemporary mobility is largely a legacy, not just of current and evolving aspirations, but these past policies. So Morphy, in fact, specifically looking at a model for Indigenous mobility, said if you really want to understand the way Aboriginal people move around, you've got to understand the sacred geography, the places that are important to them, the nodal individuals and the networks, the family and kinship networks around those people. And once you understand then you'll understand patterns of mobility. So this much we do know about mobility, but there's really not much more. In all the representative studies, they're almost all based on the census, and we know the census isn't good for counting Aboriginal people, for measuring mobility. The constructs are often culturally inappropriate, which I'll talk a bit more about later. There's case study evidence, but this can't be generalised, and a lot of it's now extremely dated. And I've just included a quote there from John Taylor, who basically points out that policymakers and service providers operating who are interested in the implications of mobility are basically operating in a vacuum, an information vacuum. If there's one key lesson from the literature, which I'd like to point out, is the remarkable resilience of these traditional drivers of mobility. These traditional drivers of kinship, culture and country. They've survived even despite hundreds of years of attempts to stamp them out. They still prevail. Place and community and place still prevail, and still a very high proportion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders recognise our homeland and regularly visit a homeland. So there's no reason to expect these things are going to change any time in the near future. And the inescapable conclusion from this is that these things must be extremely valuable to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So now I come to, is there a better way to think about mobility? And I'm going to propose just a very simple model or framework, and that is that mobility is simply a means of accessing the things that promote well-being. Okay? Includes physical goods, services, relationships. People move to access the things that promote their well-being. Very simple framework, but when you think about it, it encapsulates all those other models. It's probably most closely aligned to the economist models of maximising utility, but the economists fall down because they only worry about things if you can measure them in market prices, and they're not always the most important. You can use a gravity model and capture it with a gravity model. It incorporates McAllister's view of people moving around to access resources when they're scarce. It incorporates Murphy's model of people moving to access these things that promote their well-being, kinship networks and so on. You could even extend it to things like the very large medical literature about how mobility actually falls off. How well-being falls off when you have immobility, people with handicaps, people who are in prison. As people age, we know well-being drops off. So it's basically a sort of unifying theory or approach to how you can think about mobility, and one that I think makes more sense, and most importantly because it aligns directly with what the objective of policy should be. The objective of policy ultimately should be to maximise well-being, and that's not always immediately apparent from the things government do, but that ideally is what the objective of policy should be. So you think about this, obviously you can elaborate on this quite a bit. To get this published, I'd have to have it in a fancy diagram with arrows and boxes and arrows coming from clever words like socio-cultural background and things like that. Clearly, there's different frameworks you could use for well-being, maybe Amartya Sen's capabilities approach. There's a number of different frameworks that you could use. And you have to recognise that there's competing means. Mobility isn't the only means for accessing these things. You can sit at home with your TV on, you can have your relationships through Facebook, use your mobile phone to order pizza. You don't need to be mobile. In fact, you probably don't even need to leave the couch to access all these things if you're happy to do it that way. So there's competing ways, and these will change with social change and with technology. So if we think about mobility as a means to access the things that promote well-being, why is it going to be different for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people? Well, it's pretty straightforward. We know the things about Aboriginal culture. we're talking we as a white fella. Centrality of family and the extended kinship system is very important. It's not just the connections, but it's the quality of those relationships and the reciprocity that's important. But most of all, the role of connections to the land in self-identity and to well-being for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is pivotal. There's so many things in culture, homelands, country, songlines, etc., that relate to physical attachment, connection to the land. So it follows directly. You know, you can't get these things from sitting on the couch over Facebook or with a phone or getting them delivered. They're things, because wellbeing is constructed differently, we would expect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to be more mobile, particularly this important attachment to the land. So these are perfectly legitimate differences in values and preferences that we would expect would lead to an increase in mobility or higher mobility for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So if you're going to accept all that, then we come to the question, well, if mobility is a way of accessing things that bring you well-being, in what possible sense is Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander mobility problematic? And I think it's because of the way we view things, or it comes from the way we view things. First, I want to notice Aboriginal people aren't actually more mobile, okay? It's a particular type of mobility, okay? Aboriginal people are less likely to move interstate if you look between the census. If you look at who's in remote towns in one census and not the next, it's the white people that move out of white towns. So it's not that they're more mobility, it's a particular type of mobility, and that's temporary mobility. Movements on, daily, weekly, maybe a couple of months trips that don't necessarily involve a change of where you reside or places that you use for accommodation. So it's temporary. The problem seems to be with temporary mobility. In James Scott's book, Seeing Like a State, in the opening chapter, he invites us to think about a native forest. And he describes all the things going in that rich ecosystem, the trees, the birds that live there, the plants, the animals, all the insects, a rich diversity of an ecosystem. And then he described the advent of scientific forestry and the fact that government started taxing land where people had land holdings with forests on them, started taxing them according to how much timber could be harvested from those areas. And once they started seeing the forest in these terms, then the concepts changed, the views changed, the language changed. Everything that wasn't a tree became a weed. Everything that lived off the trees became pests. And he goes on to document lots of things in life that have come about by the state's need to measure, regulate, count and tax people. Things like urban planning. A lot of urban planning arose because of these needs. Languages, what languages were allowed to be used, what languages people were taught in. Map boundaries, even surnames. Surnames came about because of the need for governments to monitor, regulate and tax people. And when you think about so many of these constructs that we equally, because of the way we see them, we view things, and particularly about mobility to do with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. In the census, usual residence. Place of usual residence is the main way we measure population within the census, is not necessarily a useful construct for a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who often have access to a number of residences that they regularly use and visit and stay overnight. Visitor. If it's not your place of usual residence, you're a visitor. That doesn't necessarily make sense. Nuclear families, employment. When the Aboriginal Employment Development Policy was first introduced to Parliament in 1984, I think it was, there was a suggestion, which I thought was a great one, to extend the definition, the Australian Bureau of Statistics definition of employment, to include traditional activities like hunting and gathering. I never saw any more. I don't know what happened to that suggestion. But, we don't consider those things as employment. If we consider academics like me and our politicians as employed, surely we could consider elders to be employed. Open spaces, the use of open spaces by Aboriginal people we see as sort of some civil disobedience and vagrancy. Even the way maps, the main unit used in the census is local government areas. You get a lot of mobility between local government areas if you look at movements between the census. If instead we define those boundaries in terms of cultural groups or language groups, about 50% of mobility would disappear straight away. It's where we draw the lines on the map, which creates the mobility. So there's so many ways that we look at Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander with this sort of view of a state of needing to count and monitor. And I did include a quote here from Paul Memmott, who's a great researcher at University of Queensland, that temporary mobility has come to be seen as this aspect of Aboriginal culture that promotes promotes disadvantage or causes disadvantage. And as has been noted elsewhere, once you start seeing cultural differences as a cause of disadvantage, then you have these hidden forces sort of by stealth creep in for assimilation into policy and practice and service delivery. So I'd argue this is not how we should see mobility. The way we should see mobility is not as a problem, something to be overcome, but simply as a means that Aboriginal people use to access things that they value and that they value highly, things that they have cause to value and things that they have right to value in the terms of Amartya Sen's framework. So just on that note, I'll just very quickly say what we're doing in the project. The project is all about collecting data. I talked before about the information vacuum. The project is about collecting data about where people in remote Australia move, how they move, where they go, why they go, any problems, where they'd like to go but can't, barriers to mobility. And these are a map of the communities in Central Australia, mainly ones that use Alice Springs as a service centre. We're hoping to, with the community researchers, survey about 20 and 25 and collect some of the data. Here's just these are from pilots, so I don't want to hold too much in them, but the sort of data we're collecting. Services, what services do you travel away for? The main one is shopping, banking, health and so on. So we're asking why people go, what services particularly. Main reason for overnight trips. Shopping again, we see the importance of kinship networks, again visiting family and friends. Cultural activities a bit lower. Football, of course, is very important. And if you actually sort of some of the preliminary numbers, it suggests that people take, these Aboriginal people in remote Australia are taking trips about roughly every 2 weeks, an overnight trip. So it's confirming a very high degree of mobility. And the whole purpose of collecting this data is to inform policy, to inform planning, infrastructure provision, service providers, to say, well, you know, is there a way that we can deliver services better, but to deliver them in a way that's consistent with Aboriginal values and aspirations and not one that sees mobility as a problem. So I haven't even had my time warning. Thank you very much for listening.